Good morning. Morning. Still morning. Still morning. Okay. So I expect my remarks to take about a half an hour or so, and hopefully there will be some time for questions and Q&A. I think my talk is going to be a very interesting and logical follow-on from Michael's, actually. We didn't plan it that way, or maybe Kevin, the wonderful Kevin, had some inside knowledge that this was going to happen. Speaking of Kevin, my sincere thanks to Kevin Finnerty for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I'm very honoured to be here and to get a chance to speak to you. And I hope my talk will be of interest. Judging by the level of interest in the previous discussion, I'm optimistic. I'll put it to you that way. I'm optimistic. A bit more psychologizing, if you can bear with it, for a little bit more this morning. Not much talk about Percy French, it has to be said. I will make a couple of references to Percy French here, but my knowledge of Percy French is quite limited, as will become glaringly obvious to everybody. But I will make some remarks, and make some remarks generally about sexuality, adolescence, identity, and discontent. Themes we've already covered, actually, thanks to Michael's wonderful talk. And I'll leave it to you to make connections along the way, which I think are there. Okay, I'm going to read, no PowerPointing for me, I've enough of that, so I'm going to read, and I'm going to keep an eye on the time and try and keep it to half an hour. So if you could bear with me for that amount of time, I would be very, very grateful. And I'm going to have a sip of water as well, so I can keep going. Thank you. Okay. I have to confess, I had a bit of a struggle pinning down this talk, as sexuality, identity, and discontent are very broad themes. And frankly, we could probably talk about them all day. As you may have ascertained from the program, I'm going to speak about these from a psychoanalytic perspective, a perspective that has in fact long engaged with these topics. Sexuality, identity, and discontent are, we could say, intertwined within the psychoanalytic project, a field long associated with shining an unwavering and determined light on humanity, and the particularity of how we are destined to arrive at states of discontent, no matter what. The problem generally being to what extent our discontent troubles us. Here, for the purpose of this talk, what is being proposed is a discontent quite relative to and particular to sexuality and identity, two areas that have quite literally exploded over the last 25 years as Ireland has grown up and accepted that it is a milieu, it is diverse and not so easily kept under a bushel of sexual ignorance and exploitation. However, before delving into these, I'd like to offer a caveat that the discontent I'm going to reference is not altogether negative, and it is in fact important in thinking about how society and the individual are embroiled. We might even say that the increasing polarizations of today, occurring in tandem with a great opening up and liberalization of Irish society, are not unrelated. As we think of Percy French traveling extensively in the USA, Europe, and Britain in the last decades of his life, in his tours of the music halls and theatres, he would undoubtedly have come across a variety of characters and been exposed to worlds of great social, cultural, political, and sexual difference. It is impossible to think that the exciting political and social changes occurring in fin de siècle Europe did not in some way filter into his thinking and his creativity. But let's pause on that for a moment and consider some of the polarizations that are current today. In a staggeringly short period of time, and I'm going to suggest a decade or so between the years 2011 and 2019, and via a series of referenda and legislative acts, Ireland has metamorphosized from being one of the most socially repressive societies in Europe to being one of the most liberal social democracies in Europe, and a beacon of light for many around the world in respect of the liberalisation of our laws on equality, sexual diversity, and individual autonomy. We are in some ways still catching up with this, and our efforts at rooting out stigmatisation in Irish society are laudable and a very worthy and important ongoing project. Lack of hospitality and hostility towards others occurs most commonly, as Freud noted, against those who are in fact most like us, what he called the narcissism of small differences. Sometimes this spills over. Any of us watching the news this week would have seen this. Sometimes this spills over and is directed against those deemed foreign and unwilling to be more like us. The dangers of miscegenation, I think, would be another way of describing this. We know, for example, that rates of racial violence, violence against women, domestic violence, and sexual violence and intimidation, those rates are up significantly, and I'm going to give you some figures in a moment, with consequential mental health issues. These have risen significantly over the last decade, but especially over the last few years. We have important studies that show this and demonstrate that this is not only a factor of conducting better studies. The CSO's Sexual Violence Survey 2022 shows that the proportion of adults who experienced sexual violence in their lifetime was 40%, with higher levels for women compared to men. So clear differences by age and sex, with 52% of women significantly more likely to have experienced sexual violence compared with 28% of men. 65% of young women aged 18 to 24 reported the highest levels of sexual violence experienced in their lifetime. Those are quite staggering numbers. Again, I'm painting this against the backdrop of the great opening up and the unrepressing of Irish society. While widespread levels of the abject poverty of yesteryear have generally declined, there are growing rates of poverty, especially in children. The recent government support of school lunches is a tacit acceptance of this. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening. So, in conjunction with the liberalisation of Irish society and culture, there is a coincident rise in the isms: racism, misogyny, ethnocentrism, and homophobia and transphobia. Young people, in particular, are prone to being targeted for being different, and there is both an openness and an intolerance at work at and in this important and highly representative population. Psychologically, the process of arriving at a coherent identity is one of the major tasks of adolescence. And a curious aspect of this process of identification is that, and this is certainly a psychoanalytic precept, is that an identity takes its bearings not in relation to what it is, but in fact what it isn't. I am this because I am not that. If you think about the peer group, in the adolescent peer group, that will make a lot of sense to you. I am this because I am not that. In slightly more theoretical terms, Erikson, already mentioned by Michael in that lovely definition of intimacy, Erik Erikson, the great child psychologist, proposed that adolescent identity, I'm going to give a quote here, connotes both a sameness within oneself, which is self-sameness, and a persistent sharing of some kind of essential character with others, end quote. So again, this idea that identity is something that happens in concert with others. It's not something we have, it's something that we develop and form in and through others, what some would describe as the big other. This notion of self-sameness or continuity of self, helps accommodate the myriad physical, cognitive, and role changes inherent to adolescence, along with all of the confusing social cues of early life. And that was a very nice description of the temper tantrum of the two-year-old that we had earlier, and how important actually the temper tantrum is, difficult as they are. Certainly, we have arrived at a time when this is arguably not an easy task. This arrived at a time of forming a coherent sense of oneself. Not helped, for example, I suggest, by the 58 gender options on Facebook to choose for one's profile, including, if you're interested, pangender, genderqueer, agender, cisgender, non-binary, and if you're not happy with any of those, you can pick other, if none of the other 57 work. In this climate of choice, which I will return to, there is much to choose from. And while the opening up of traditional gender options is very important and has made a big difference to young people in particular, we can nonetheless think about a connection between what we currently have are epidemic levels of anxiety and depression, and the now ubiquitous and endless menus of choice. Try, for example, ordering a plain, undoctored cup of coffee. We've always had double standards in operation and culture, and often simultaneous opening up and closing off, often weighted more on one side than the other. And this is especially so, I suggest, in the intersecting areas of sexuality and identity. We are working to address those issues in schools through, for example, anti-bullying policies and anti-discriminatory practices, but we have a lot more to do. The discontent of young people is palpable for all to see. Our psychotherapy practice is inundated with children and adolescents refusing to go to school, for example, and often suffering from serious levels of anxiety and depression. This is a growing major problem, and especially so since the 2020 global pandemic. Given the prevalence of this, we need to think about what this means and ask ourselves, what are we not giving young people? It is a mistake, I suggest, to conclude on this as problems arising solely from learning challenges, from social anxieties, from bad behavior, or improperly parented children. We must, I think, acknowledge that there is something not working at a group and social level that is affecting young people whose discontent, sometimes serious to the point of major depression, self-harm, and even suicidality, is both highly particular to them and their circumstances, but is it not also a way of registering socio-cultural pathologies? Are we asking too much of young people? Is Irish society in some way contributing to making them sick? What are they trying to tell us? These are big questions, bordering on being too big for here. But let's try to prefer a few possible answers. First, however, let's explore what adolescence is, and by drawing on psychoanalysis, which has long made important connections between sexuality and culture, try to depathologize contemporary discontent and reconsider it as a vital aspect of lived experience that has in fact much to tell us. Some of you may have already thought about the coincidence of identity formation and the development of sexuality in adolescence and young adulthood. Adolescence, most would agree, is a bridge between childhood and adulthood, a period of biopsychosocial development and a formal period of exploration, discovery, and creativity for young people. It's also, as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips puts it, a time of struggle when the child, literally wants to kill off the parents, or rather kill off parental influence over them. It's probably a better way of putting it, as some of you probably know only too well. As the American psychologist G. Stanley Hall put it, quote, adolescence is when the very worst and the very best impulses in the human soul struggle against each other for possession, end quote. Yet, childhood is a modern invention. It did not exist in the medieval world, when life was short, and according to the historian of childhood, Philip Aries, its invention, certainly its modern invention, dates to the 16th and 17th centuries and coincides not only with the aforementioned Enlightenment, but with children, just in relation to children, having a better chance of survival, especially among the upper classes. Children began at this time to have their own costumes, appear in portraits, go to school, and the word child began slowly to take on its modern meaning. There were more words, for example, used to describe them, and we have, for example, the introduction of chip, kid, foundling, brat, and kinshin. These enter into the English language, although for a long time childhood was more or less limited to boys. That said, well into the 19th century, most Western people's relationship to God was actually deemed far more important than the relationship to parents or children. It's only very recently that we have accepted that childhood has a history, and it matters in determining who we are. Again, I'm going to refer to Adam Phillips. He notes we've come to see a kind of democratization of childhood and adolescence, in which it has come to matter what children actually say. They are no longer seen merely as verbally incompetent adults, but the tellers of truths. And with it has come, as he puts it, a burden of privilege, as well as the idealization of childhood as a site of visionary frankness, as well as amusement. And we have with this our contemporary understanding that the psychological child is in need of much understanding and training. There's no question that the human child, compared to the young of the animal world, requires a great deal of support and help to ensure survival. And the increasing attentiveness given to childhood marks the contemporary era as firmly focused on the idea of childhood and the need for formal training to prepare for adult life. As Aries concludes, the evolution of contemporary society, he argues, the evolution of contemporary society is intelligible if we attest to the astonishing growth of the family, with childhood at its center. The family as a container for childhood, and if, as Aries purports, this is less the result of the impact of individualism than we have in the recent invention of childhood, and I'm quoting him here, radically redescribed what a person is and what life might be. Into the increasingly significant role of childhood in personhood, Sigmund Freud arrived, and with, of course, an emphasis on the unconscious. Freud's discovery was not the unconscious itself, but its manifestations and its role so often unacknowledged or refused even in human suffering. He admired how children and young people frankly expressed what adults hardly dared to venture, revealing the unconscious as self-evident and uncompromising, in revealing the forbidden, the repressed, the unacceptable, the bad, the hateful, and so on, forces that continue to operate and grow stronger by their very refusal. Scandalously, he proposed that all adult forms of sexuality have early infantile precursors, locatable in a series of unsocialized drives he unhesitatingly described as polymorphous and perverse. So we start off as polymorphously perverse, pleasure-seeking little beings, and we're socialized into the more or less generally acceptable adult forms of sexuality. This is added to by a society's particular by a society and a group's emphases on what socialization should be. And of course, this varies from society to society. Freud's insistence on the importance of allowing children to speak, to give voice to their drives, wishes, and struggles, and his acknowledgement of their centrifugal place in the intersection of language, culture, and personhood, or subjectivity as we often refer to it, has been followed up ever since by generations of analysts and therapists. Language is what makes us. It humanizes us and ultimately allows us to have a sexuality. There is, because you cannot think about a socialization process in the absence of a languaging process. There's an easy example we can draw from to show how the body and sexuality are languaged effectively into being. We say, for example, that we have a body. We do not say that we are a body. It's actually a very important concept. We have a sexuality not as something that magically appears at whatever age we decide adolescence is, and that seems to be lengthening these days, starting earlier and going on for longer, but as something that emerges out of processes of constriction and socialization that temper childhood drives into the socially acceptable by building upon their earlier foundations and influences. Adolescents are doubly tasked with also consolidating a sense of identity. And again, that in no way arises solely in this period, but builds upon what has already been fomented and laid down. All of this happens in and through language, the language of home, school, society, and culture. It is no surprise that adolescents are often the ones who invent language, and whose language is the one we're constantly having to learn. Some words entered into the Oxford Dictionary in 2023 include adultification, the action or practice of treating children or young people like adults in ways that are considered harmful. Other words entered into the Oxford Dictionary last year: flirtationship, frontlash, which is the opposite of backlash, simp, and turnt, which is stimulated or intoxicated by alcohol or drugs. Have you tried listening recently to the music of young adults? Even Taylor Swift, quite away herself from being a teenager, is getting in on the act with, for example, Down Bad. Some of you may know the song. Down Bad, a love interest in the sense that a person is obsessed with someone to the point of it being bad for them. So this is enormously creative and important endeavor, the invention of words, is a vital way for children and adolescents to tell us about personhood and about society, about our world, and I'm suggesting that we're perhaps not listening to them well enough. This is a little bit of a mix of everything, a few lines from Edgar Allan Poe. Alone. 4 lines. From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. Freud is perhaps helpful here again, in arguably his clearest and most concise work on sexuality and culture, Civilization and Its Discontents. He was particularly interested in what was unassimilable for modern people in the process of acculturation, a process, he argues, that begins in childhood. No one can ever become fully assimilated, totally identify with or invest in their culture or group. Yet everybody needs to acculturate in some way. Many do in their own way. We need other people to help us. And ultimately, he argues, because we give up the pleasure-seeking drives and the narcissism of the early pleasure-seeking drives, we are doomed to be discontented. That is the process of acculturation or civilization, as he called it. The primary tool of acculturation, again, is language, the imposition of laws and rules to repress self-serving and destructive impulses by channeling or sublimating them into socially productive activities. No, you can't have the crunchy now because you will spoil your tea. You know, it's the application of a law, of a restriction, of a prohibition, and so on. We are obliged to rein in the pleasure-seeking drives and submit to what our group or culture offers in exchange. What does it offer in exchange? Identity, security, history, purpose, etc. The result is inevitably discontent. We accept a limited, socially sanctioned satisfaction while endlessly craving the Edenesque ideal or fantasy of what was given up. And sometimes we can take up a position of imagining that others have not given it up, that they still have it. We can talk about that afterwards if you want. But that would be a very, very simple way of beginning to think about how racism works, for example, and how misogyny works, this idea that others have something that I don't have. A psychoanalyst after Freud, Jacques Lacan, added to this by asserting that the fundamental problem of human relations is the lack of oneness or unity in them. Any coupledom is always a relation of two who may align, and hopefully align in what they desire, but they're ultimately two completely different entities. He called this, rather strikingly, the absence of the sexual relationship, and culture and group identity comes in to pave over this crack by offering sometimes a high degree of group unity to fill in cracks of individual doubt, fear, or anxiety produced by dominant discourses. Every culture has a strategy for managing difference and providing self-identities and facilitating in different ways mutual interdependence between people and objects, the objects of their desire. In sum, we can't divorce sexuality from culture. They are inextricably linked. Culture is the result, you could say, of the non-existence of the sexual relationship, with culture being the symptomatic expression of never meeting with what we hope and dream for in human sexuality. Therefore, we turn to culture, and human sexuality limited and delimited by the exigencies, paradoxes, and elaborations of culture itself. In the Ireland of today, we can probably agree that the lifting of age-old repressions of sexuality and identity have altered immeasurably the landscape for adolescents and young people navigating their way into a sense of who and what they are. The lifting of many social and cultural repressions has made a big and very welcome difference. But we are mindful this opening up is situated within certain parameters. The pleasures and possibilities afforded to people living in a post-industrial, late capitalistic, Western, democratic, neoliberalist society. Sorry, it's a very long sentence, but all of those words are actually important. Post-industrial, late capitalistic, Western, democratic, neoliberalist society. The social bond, what links a community together, is accomplished less through identification these days than through consummation, consuming. And this consuming takes on an addictive, must-have quality. The frenetic consumerism that technology multiplies and puts on the market more and more rapidly is a desperate attempt to remunerate a deficit of satisfaction that is structural. Remember earlier I said we rescind the self-serving, pleasure-seeking drives of childhood under the sway of socialization. Some argue, and we can maybe add this to Michael's very important points earlier, some argue we have moved into an area, and this I suppose is a slightly different take on Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, thinking of Dostoevsky. God is dead everything is permitted. That's from the brothers Karamazov. Some of you may know that. Psychoanalysis argues, no, this isn't really so. If and Dostoevsky, if God is dead, everything is permitted. Psychoanalysis inverts this and says, if God is dead, everything is prohibited. And that might sound like a strange thing to say when I've just been talking about the lifting of old repressions and the liberalization of Irish society. But if you think about it, it makes sense, where it's almost, where there is endless prohibitions without necessarily being a centralization of them in the ways that there used to be, for example. And also, it gets into the complicated notion of God being dead, and a dead God and a dead Father. Nothing more powerful than one who's dead. Much more powerful than a living one, especially if they open their mouths. Okay. Maybe just I think about 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Can we do another few minutes? Okay. We have, it is argued, transitioned, and I say that by way of introducing this point, transitioned from a society of prohibition or repression to a society of enjoyment, one dominated by the will to enjoy. Okay? So we have now an imperative, an injunction, you must enjoy, as opposed to you must not do, you must enjoy. Very simple, commonplace example of this now is that it's very difficult for people to go on holidays anymore. They must go and have an experience. I was telling somebody recently, what did you do on your holiday? Well, I sat around and read a few books. I found this absolutely unimaginable, that you weren't ziplining across the Grand Canyon or something. So you must enjoy. You must enjoy. But let's try to draw this in connection with this will to enjoy, this injunction. We now live in a time under the sway of a commandment to enjoy. Can we link this with contemporary discontent? Cynicism, retreat into the private realm, malaise, isolation, and narcissism, we can say, characterize this epoch in which our belief in institutions such as government, education, schooling, and even history itself has diminished. Again, not unrelated to the processes of deconstruction, certainly, and postmodernism. Not necessarily without good or rather scandalous reasons that these changes haven't happened, for good reason, for scandalous reasons, as I think some have already alluded to. There's a reason we don't believe in our institutions in ways that we used to before. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of reign of choice. Some call it a tyranny of choice, in which we are inundated with options for almost everything, even things that aren't really options, like opting into this or that web application. I don't really think that's much of an option. Or this is one, choose the right medical treatment. We have to choose our own medical. We're given options when we go to the doctor now and when we go to the consultant. If our era is one of rampant individualism, in what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls our liquid society, where group identity is less unifying, young people nonetheless are expected to choose the right subjects, the right career, a sexuality or gender, even the right kind of life to live in a world that isn't only changing before their eyes. Some say 40% of the jobs primary school children will be working in haven't even been invented yet. In a world they know that is actually in an existential, environmental, and climactic crisis. And it will fail. I beg your pardon, it will fall to them to fix it. Is it any wonder? Teenagers, adolescents are hitting the opt-out button. It was Adorno who noted in Freud what he termed the destructive the destructive content with culture. And by this he meant that we do well to be alert to the dangers of cultural miscegenation, the short-sightedness of ignoring the gap at the heart of culture when it is overwritten by cultural myths and ideals of harmony that are neither possible nor fully realizable. And their function is to override discontent with the aspirational and impossible logic of a kind of collective and individual unity of purpose and drive. But in this tensioned space, it is possible for more equitable and proportionate existences to be fought for and secured. A problem today, this tension, and this is a tension between the gap at the heart of culture and the ideals of harmony on the other side. A problem today is that this tension between the universal and the particular, found at the heart of problems of culture, which is so necessary for political action, social conscience, and creativity, is subsumed by the increasing demands of universality and modes of mass exploitation characteristic of the domination of the markets, the discourse of the markets which care not about people, but about profit. That's all the market cares about. That's more profit, and there's no end. There's no end to profit. There's no point at which it's enough. In fact, in this period of late modernity, people are really what get in the way of profit making. The problem is people, actually, and we know this as we move more and more towards automation, artificial intelligence. You'll get rid of the people and things will become easier and more profitable. It's always people who bung up the machinery of profit production, as Charlie Chaplin brilliantly demonstrated in Modern Times in 1936. There's a lovely scene in that film where he literally goes into this machine and bungs it up. It's the States to 1936. Adding to this are theories of rationalism and positivity, which today are raised to the status of ideology in our increasingly administered and scientistic world. We talked about not science, but scientism, science elevated to a kind of religion that places a premium on self-knowledge and more accurately on self-satisfaction and enjoyment at the level of the individual as opposed to the collective. A solution to this cultural pathology, what I've just described, is malaise or depression. It may sound odd that I describe that as a solution. But malaise, depression, or anxiety is a way of opting out, you could say, of this. We could approach this in another way, for example, via, and I've already alluded to this idea of space. So thinking about this maybe topologically in a problem of space. I'm almost finished, please. Bear with me for another moment or two. A society of prohibition is one that allows for space from the image, a sense of distance between the surface and what lies beneath, something beyond the barrier of prohibition. The consuming, suffocating presence of the current epoch is amplified by technology and gadgetry and our growing inability to switch them off and produce an all-important waiting, a distance between a person and the immediacy of objects. The decline into depression or boredom is one solution to this lack of transcendental space. We can even see how in the treatment of mental health these have come together in unprecedented ways to eliminate the symbolic space of absence, with an average 10-minute consultancy being the norm for busy, overworked psychiatrists. Perhaps then opting out isn't only disengagement, but the creation of space, and a necessary slowing down to ascertain one's place in the world. Well-being programs have their place, but cannot do much when people, young people, are not well in their being. Something more is needed, especially as science enters in unprecedented ways into perceiving people in biological, genetic, and universally quantifiable ways, when history is repeating in frightening ways around the world. We need to talk it out and talk it through. What if instead we allowed space for individualities, for subjective particularity, for slowing down, giving of space for individual and different voices? that would mean giving over time, attention and space to what is uncertain, to what is unknown, what cannot be guaranteed, and also, of course, to consider what is certain. The pandemic reminded us we're fallible and mortal. A tiny invisible virus can bring the world to its knees. Young people, our national treasure, know all about these things. And as the Green School marches in 2019 and the recent college protests show, they want a better world than the world we're currently offering them. They have a lot to tell us, and their hope and belief is akin, I suggest, to an intervention in our current malaise and apathy arising from dominant discourses and the ideologies that underpin them. Many of them, young people, don't want to be dupes of the illusions of satisfactions today and are looking for better ways of recognizing and elucidating human diversity. Let us listen to the suffering of young people who are wonderfully noisy nuisances that won't stay put, won't be told what to do, and cannot be willed away. They offer messages that reflect not only human desire at an entirely individual level, but also the conditions of life more generally. As only Beckett could put it in Endgame, you're on Earth, there's no cure for that. I think I'll pause there. I was going to leave the last word to Percy French and read later on, but I'm going to let you do that yourselves and suggest that you do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Dr. Eve Watson for that very interesting presentation. We're going to take a tea and coffee break in a couple of minutes. We're going to go inside the Castlecoot House because of the weather, but we will allow a few minutes for questions. And there's a lady there at the back, Adrian.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of things I'd like to ask and say, but you didn't comment, well, you weren't meant to comment on the former speaker, but the dismantling of everything we built our own lives or the lives of the people who went before us, the Judeo-Christian ethic and everything that Michael talked about. Some of what you're speaking about may have been a result of that. And I know there are people who won't like me mentioning this, but I have come face to face with something that has troubled a lot of young people. And that is the fact that their siblings have been destroyed in the womb by the consent of people, by doctors who proclaim, are supposed to look after life. Many young people are deeply affected by the disposability of the live child. Their siblings and siblings of families they know. I don't expect you really to comment on this, but I know that is a contributing factor to the endless amount of depression that there is among young people. And I'd also like to comment that about childhood, and children were only seen in portraits and all that, but we do have a mental picture of Christ receiving lots of children and hoping they'd come to him and keep coming to him and commenting on their innocence and their love. I have to add that bit, but I have seen depression among young people who have realised that a member of their family hasn't even been allowed to be born.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Anybody else want to make a contribution before we take our break? Or Eve, I don't know if you wish to respond to. Okay.
I don't think there was a question there.
Yeah, fair. Yeah. Fine. Michael, okay.
Eve, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And I could see quite an overlap in our thinking. One of the things that struck me, and I wonder what you would think about this, is that just in terms of questions that came up with me in relation to what's the way forward. I mean, where the cohort you were thinking about really is adolescence, and where's the space? What you're describing is essentially an existential crisis, which is actually, and this is the issue of therapy comes into this, which is, and my concern is with the therapeutic world, that many therapists are not actually equipped psychologically or philosophically. They're trying to treat a symptom called depression, when in fact the human being is suffering an existential spiritual crisis as a result of a social system which has left them swinging, psychologically, emotionally, trying to find a way. Where's the front line there in relation to what do you have a model or a sense of what might be offered into that space? I suppose.
Well, the first thought I have is around the training of psychotherapists, and which is something I'm involved in and have been involved in for quite a long time, actually. And maybe you don't know this, but certainly at postgraduate level, where most psychotherapy takes place, it involves also a schooling in philosophy and critical thinking. And that is actually really important. Schooling in the philosophies that inform psychoanalytic and psychotherapy practices. This really matters. So we study philosophically what humanism is, and for example, which would inform a great many of the psychotherapy practices. I suppose, coming from the particular background and orientation I come from, and I suppose, building on the models of Freud and Erikson, who advocated that the psychotherapist should be schooled in nearly all of the thinking practices. Lacan described psychoanalysts needing to be practitioners of the symbolic, and not only needing to do crossword puzzles every day. That was one of his pieces of advice when he was asked, how does one become a psychoanalyst? Go into analysis and do crossword puzzles every day. But to be practitioners of the symbolic, which means keeping up with what's happening in the world. And that means, being schooled by the people that come along to us, particularly our young people, because they're the ones really, and that was the point I'm trying to make, that they're the ones that have a lot to tell us. But we do need to have a good critical understanding of what's happening in the world and the social, cultural, political, and economic forces that are at work, and ideological forces that are at work in contemporary discontent and malaise. So that we can have a more rounded, contextualized picture of what might be happening for a young person. And also, I mean, we really could do with doing much more with school curricula in terms of fostering, and this gets to your point, critical thinking. It's fostering critical thinking. We have a great reliance in our school system on rote learning and preparing for the exams. And that has its place, but it's critical thinking. There's a reason why so many of the philosophers and thinkers and sociologists you referred to, Jean-François Lyotard and Michel Foucault and others, are French, because primary school children in France are taught philosophy and learn philosophy. So critical thinking is fostered. By the way, Lacan knocked around with all of those in Paris at the same time, and it came up with a very different way of thinking about human nature and subjectivity. So schooling would be another place, intervening early and young with and I mean, I'm very interested in this idea as well. It's something I've been working on over the last while and it's dialectics and dialecticism. I know you'll know what that is, which is the idea of engaging in a kind of critical discourse that facilitates argument and counter-argument. It builds on a Socratic style of engagement and so on. It builds on Hegel's notion of thesis and antithesis and synthesis, antithesis, and thesis, and the idea that with engaged and dialectical debate and argument, we can build in the old but come up with something new. It's accommodating the old. The issue you drew attention is the danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. that we can certainly take up a critical position in relation to what's come before and what is now. And we need to do that, actually. But to leave room for it to inform what is to come. That is dialecticism, and I'm interested in that. But that is a way of engaging civilly, civil discourse, and in debating an argumentative style. That has to be facilitated, and public figures need to do that, and we need to see more of that. And freedom of speech, yeah. Yes.